What forces compel an empire to look beyond its familiar borders, to cast its shadow across forbidding deserts and towering mountain ranges? The history of the 19th century is often recounted through the lens of European expansion into Africa and Southeast Asia, a grand, rapacious movement that transformed the globe. Yet, in the vast, beating heart of Eurasia, a drama of equal magnitude unfolded, one easily overlooked but critical to world history: Russia's relentless, decades-long conquest of Central Asia. This monumental campaign saw the Tsarist state add over 1.5 million square miles of territory and incorporate 6 million subjects into its dominion. It is a story of strategic cunning, logistical failure, brutal warfare, and international rivalry that brought the world's two greatest empires to the very brink of global war. To understand this conquest, we must first appreciate the land itself, a place of extraordinary antiquity and culture. Central Asia was not a vacant land awaiting colonization. It was a jewel of history, home to ancient cities and sophisticated civilizations whose origins stretched back long before the rise of the Moscow Tsars. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, legendary names along the Silk Road, served as beacons of commerce and learning for millennia. The region had been fundamentally reshaped by the cataclysmic arrival of the Mongols in the 1200s, and by the 15th century, much of the territory carried the indelible marks of nomadic rule under powerful Turkic clans. Though divided, this territory was still home to formidable power structures, which for centuries maintained a wary distance from the growing Russian bear to the north. But as Russia industrialized and consolidated its power, these distant lands, known for their exotic trade goods and strategic position, began to look less like trading partners and more like a tempting prize. Directly abutting the southern frontier of the sprawling Russian Empire lay the remnants of the once mighty Kokand Khanate, a loose confederation that, by the 18th century, had fractured into three largely independent political units known as the Junior Horde, the Middle Horde, and the Senior Horde. These groupings, composed of nomadic and semi-nomadic Kazakh peoples, numbered around 500,000 individuals each by the 19th century and occupied the vast steppes that served as a buffer. Further south, where the rivers nurtured oasis settlements and legendary cities, lay the settled, agrarian powers of the region, the three great khanates of Khiva, Kokand, and Bukhara. Though Bukhara had officially styled itself an emirate in 1785, these were the central political and economic hubs. Russia had engaged in intermittent trade with these Central Asian powers for decades, but the relationship was perpetually strained. Constant complaints poured into St. Petersburg detailing the raiding of Russian caravans, attacks on traders, and the frequent kidnappings of Russian subjects for sale. This instability, coupled with Russia's emerging imperial drive, guaranteed that conflict was inevitable.
The era of active Russian imperial interest in Central Asia truly began with the accession of Peter the Great. Peter's strategic vision saw Central Asia not just as a land for trade, but as a potential field for the grand expansion of Russian power toward the warm water ports of India and the riches of the Orient. In 1717, the Tsar, fresh from his successes against Sweden, decided to make a bold statement. He ordered Prince Alexander Bekovich Cherkassky to lead a large expedition, several thousand men strong, against the powerful Khanate of Khiva. The expedition marched deep into Khivan territory and succeeded in routing the local army in battle. Yet, Bekovich Cherkassky committed a fatal error. Believing diplomacy was a less costly path than continued war, he accepted what appeared to be a genuine peace overture from the Khivan Khan, Shirgazi. The Khan's treachery was swift and absolute. Feigning generosity and concern for the Russian troops' welfare, Shirgazi suggested that the exhausted Russians be dispersed into several separate towns for better supply and rest. It was a classic, devastating military trap. Once the Russian forces were separated and their defenses lowered, The Khivans launched coordinated attacks on each location, wiping out virtually every Russian soldier, including Bekovich-Cherkassky himself, who was executed. It was a betrayal as brazen as it was costly, leaving an enduring scar on Russian imperial pride. However, Peter the Great was too deeply embroiled in the ongoing Great Northern War in Europe to divert the necessary resources for immediate, crushing retribution. The insult festered, a century-old debt waiting to be paid. In the decades that followed, Russia cautiously maintained its interest in the region, primarily through the fragmented Kazakh lands. Slowly, the Kazakhs were drawn into the Russian sphere of influence. The Little Horde accepted Russian suzerainty in 1731, followed closely by the Middle Horde in 1734. This was not an outright military conquest, but a calculated political maneuver, effectively incorporating these vast northern steppes into the Russian Empire and creating a recognizable border that largely corresponds to modern maps. Only the Senior Horde resisted, successfully maintaining its independence until the 1820s, when it was eventually subjugated not by the Russians, but by the burgeoning power of the neighboring Kokand Khanate. This dynamic, where the Central Asian powers fought among themselves, often played perfectly into Russian hands, allowing them to wait, watch, and strike at the opportune moment. The demand for revenge and security finally reached a fever pitch in the 1830s. The continuing attacks on Russian trade caravans were deemed intolerable, and the century-old humiliation delivered by Khiva demanded atonement. Count Vasily Perovsky, the military governor at Warrenburg, became the loudest advocate for action. He delivered impassioned, indignant arguments, accusing Khiva of deliberate malice, robbery, banditry, and disrespectful abuse of majesty. The plan for a new massive assault was initiated as early as 1835. Yet, the Central Asian theater posed monumental logistical hurdles unlike anything the Russians faced in Europe. Chief among them was the sheer scale of support required for an army crossing the harsh terrain, specifically the thousands of camels needed to transport supplies and equipment across the arid steppes. These practical problems delayed the expedition until October 1839. For all their meticulous planning, Perovsky made a fatal, tragic historical blunder, echoing Napoleon's defeat in Russia only decades earlier. He utterly failed to account for the brutal, unforgiving climate. The winter of 1839-1840 was exceptionally savage, one of the worst seen in memory across the steppes, with temperatures rarely climbing above freezing. The deep snows and ceaseless wind turned the march into a slow, frozen agony. Men and animals perished daily. By February, 1 in 5 of Perovsky's men were dead, not a single casualty inflicted by the Khivan enemy, but purely by the pitiless Central Asian elements. By May, the expedition, a spectacular monument to imperial hubris and poor planning, was called off in disgrace. Perovsky's career should have ended there, but fate and imperial necessity had other plans.
The 1840s saw a Russian strategic readjustment. Rather than launching massive, high-risk, deep penetrations, they focused on piecemeal territorial gains and consolidating control over the rebellious Kazakh territories. But by the 1850s, the ambitions returned in earnest, driven by a key strategic goal: establishing a secure, defensible border along the course of the Syr-Darya River. In a miraculous turn of events, the disgraced General Perovsky was given a chance at redemption. He was dispatched to campaign along the river, targeting strategic positions held by the Kokand Khanate. This new, revised expedition proved far more successful. In 1853, Perovsky's forces achieved a critical breakthrough when they stormed the fortress at Akhmeshet, modern-day Kyzylorda, Kazakhstan. Using sophisticated military engineering, they undermined the fortress walls with explosives, creating a decisive breach that allowed Russian troops to storm the defenses, seize the post, and establish a tangible new imperial frontier along the river's course. Just as Russian power was accelerating, a massive external distraction arose: the Crimean War in Europe and the Black Sea, which pulled the overwhelming majority of Russia's military resources away from the Central Asian frontier after 1853. Yet the work continued quietly. The Surdaria line was slowly expanded and new fortifications were established, such as Fort Vernoy, built in 1854 on the future site of Almaty. However, the task of manning and supplying these distant, isolated forts proved immensely difficult. Russia's understanding of the vast region's logistics and geography remained woefully poor, leading to a frontier that was far less manageable than the Tsar had hoped. This logistical headache, coupled with rising international tension, guaranteed a renewed military effort in the 1860s. Why did Russia return with such ferocious energy in the 1860s? The answer lies at the intersection of three overwhelming factors. First, the strategic imperative of frontier security remained paramount. Second, in the wake of the Crimean War debacle, Russia desperately sought to reassert its global prestige, competing fiercely with the British Empire in what became known as the Great Game. Britain's expansion into southern Asia and the Middle East, particularly their increasing influence over Afghanistan, brought the two colossal empires into dangerous proximity, with the Central Asian khanates acting as vulnerable buffer states. Every Russian gain was viewed with alarm in London and vice versa. Finally, a compelling economic factor arose. The American Civil War had drastically curtailed the global supply of cotton, making access to the fine cotton markets of Central Asia an urgent economic necessity for Russian industry. This powerful combination of security needs, imperial rivalry, and economic interest galvanized Russia to resume military campaigns against the Kokand Khanate starting in 1861. The campaign was systematic and ruthlessly efficient. Russia seized several strategic positions, including Yenya Karan in 1861 and Turkestan and Shymkent in 1864. But all these captures were merely preparations, stepping stones toward the ultimate objective, Tashkent. Tashkent was not just another city, it was the wealthiest, most commercially vital urban center in all of Central Asia. Taking it would not only deal a catastrophic blow to the Kokand Khanate, but would effectively assure Russian dominance across the entire region. The initial attack, in the winter of 1864, led by General Mikhail Chernyanov, was repulsed, a stark reminder of the region's formidable defenses. But Chernyanov, tenacious and ambitious, returned the following May with rested, reinforced troops. The acting Kokand Khan, Alamkul, attempted to meet the Russians in a field battle outside the city walls, gambling everything on a direct confrontation. The gamble failed spectacularly. The Russian forces, disciplined and equipped with superior modern artillery, overwhelmed Alamkul's army, and the Khan himself was killed. With the main defense broken, Russian troops swiftly breached the ancient city walls. What followed were 2 days of intense, stubborn street fighting as defenders resisted house by house, until finally, the smoke cleared and the Russian imperial flag was raised over Tashkent. In a remarkable twist of command, Tsar Alexander II had actually not authorized the capture of Tashkent, intending only to pressure the Khanate. Chernyanov, sensing the moment, had acted first, presenting the government with a fait accompli. Although Chernyanov never received another major military assignment, perhaps due to his blatant insubordination, the Russian government gleefully accepted the conquest and honored him as the Lion of Tashkent. With its commercial heart cut out, the broken Kokand Khanate was forced to sign a humiliating treaty, ceding the majority of its remaining territory, granting Russia preferential trading rights, and agreeing to pay a crippling annual indemnity for Russian protection. The fall of Tashkent was a watershed moment, marking an explicit declaration of Russian imperial intent that shattered the regional balance of power. To the west, the powerful Emirate of Bukhara watched in immediate, profound alarm.
Though Bukhara and Kokand had long been rivals, frequently fighting over control of key centers, the Emir of Bukhara knew they were next in line for the inevitable Russian attack. Hoping to preempt the Russian consolidation, Bukharan armies marched east, attempting to seize disputed border territories like Khojand from the weakened Kokandis. They also dared to meet the Russians in battle near Zhizak. The result was a devastating one-sided rout. The Bukharans were thoroughly defeated, losing their limited supply of modern artillery, and their main army structure collapsed. Russia capitalized immediately, annexing Khojand for themselves alongside the key fortresses of Uratube and Zhizak.
With Kokand reduced to a husk and Bukhara publicly humiliated, Russia moved to formalize and centralize its new colonial authority. A governor-generalship was established for the newly conquered region centered in Tashkent. The man chosen to lead this new imperial domain was the ethnic German Konstantin Kaufmann, who would hold the post for the next 2 decades, becoming the true architect of Russian Central Asia. It was Kaufmann who organized the next major military campaign, driving deep into Bukharan territory in 1868, culminating in the capture of the ancient glittering prize of Samarkand. After the city fell almost immediately, Kaufmann, supremely confident in his military supremacy, made his own grave miscalculation. He dispatched the bulk of his forces to pursue the retreating Bukharans, leaving only a meager garrison of 700 Russian men to defend the massive Samarkand citadel. Kaufmann pressed on, defeating the main Bukharan army at the Battle of Kurgan in June 1868, but back in Samarkand, his overconfidence nearly cost Russia the entire campaign. An immense army of some 30,000 Bukharans, Kokandis, and allied tribal fighters rose up, determined to retake the sacred city. Outnumbered 30-1, the 700 Russian defenders fortified themselves within the walls of the citadel. Pounded ceaselessly by artillery and suffering devastating casualties, the tiny Russian force nonetheless held out for a desperate, brutal week. News of the desperate siege finally reached Kaufmann, who immediately reversed course and rushed his army back to relieve the trapped garrison. The sight of Kaufmann's returning victorious army was enough. The massive Bukharan force scattered before he arrived. With the loss of Samarkand and the utter destruction of its military might, Bukhara followed Kokand in submission. Most of its territory was annexed, Russian merchants were granted comprehensive trading privileges, and the emir was forced to pay an indemnity, leaving only its final neighbor, Khiva, with its pride intact. Khiva, the site of Russia's 2 great historical failures, remained the final target. Determined not to repeat the past, Kaufmann meticulously planned his 3rd and final phase of conquest for 1873. He ignored the lessons of Perovsky and Bekovich-Cherkassky at his peril. Kaufmann prepared 4 distinct divisions to attack Khiva simultaneously from multiple directions, 1 across the Caspian Sea, 2 from existing Russian territory in the north, and a final division driving west from the newly established base in Tashkent. Crucially, the attack was timed for the summer, and the troops were well supplied and fully equipped to cross the arid deserts. Such overwhelming coordinated preparations ultimately proved almost superfluous. Having witnessed the swift and devastating defeat of the other Central Asian powers, the Khivans had no stomach for a fight. Russia was able to seize the crucial Khiva oasis with minimal resistance from the Khan and only scattered, localized opposition from various local tribes. Soon after, the Khan of Khiva bent the knee, agreeing to become a Russian protectorate, complete with an indemnity and trade privileges, just like the others. However, the Russian commanders still craved a moment of pure military glory. Kaufmann, tragically, chose to find this glory by authorizing an appalling act of vengeance against the local tribes, particularly the Yomud Turkmen, who had mounted some of the only genuine resistance. He reasoned that the 8th Turkestan Company, which had not yet seen significant action, needed a chance to distinguish itself. On July 7, 1873, they earned their distinction by sweeping through multiple Yomud villages, engaging in a horrific, systematic slaughter of anyone they could find. This chilling massacre continued for 3 weeks until Kaufmann deemed the Yomuds permanently subdued. Even Kaufmann, a ruthless imperialist, was later so ashamed of the scale of the violence that he ordered the massacre to be omitted from his official history of the campaign. The final chapter of formal conquest began with a rebellion.
In 1875, a major uprising erupted back in the already diminished Kokand Khanate. Local anger at Russian control, coupled with resentment toward the subservient ruling Khan, led to most of the Khan's armies turning against him and forcing him into exile. The rebels, however, proved entirely incapable of defeating the forces of the Russian Empire. When Kaufmann's troops arrived in January 1876, the rebels were annihilated at the Battle of Andijan, and their leaders were summarily executed. With confidence in the local Khanate completely destroyed, Russia took the final step. They abolished it entirely, integrating the remaining territory directly into the Russian Empire. With Kokand gone and Khiva and Bukhara neutralized as protectorates, only the independent Turkmen tribes of the vast Karakum Desert remained outside Russian control, a territory corresponding to modern Turkmenistan. These scattered people possessed no unified authority and faced terrible odds against Russia's ambition to extend its control all the way down to the borders of British Afghanistan.
Despite the inevitability of defeat, the Turkmen put up a final heroic resistance that surprised the Russians. In September 1879, they mounted a staunch defense of the fortress of Göktepe, where soldiers and thousands of civilians had gathered for protection. The Russian forces launched an aggressive siege, bombarding the walls, but overestimated their own strength. Their desperate attempt to storm the fortress walls was repulsed with heavy losses, forcing the Russians to retreat in disgrace. The Turkmen had bought themselves only a single year of reprieve. A second, much larger Russian army arrived in December 1880, led by the renowned general Mikhail Skobelev. After securing the surrounding region, this second siege was relentless. Skobelev's forces ultimately cracked the defenses and stormed the fortress. The retribution was swift and horrifying. An estimated 15,000 Turkmen, both soldiers and civilians inside Göktepe, were killed by the victorious Russians. The Battle of Göktepe stands as the last major battle of the entire Central Asian conquest. Although Russia continued to fight scattered Turkmen resistance for a few more years, the capture of the ancient city of Merv in 1884 effectively marked the end of independent resistance and the complete subjugation of Central Asia. All that remained now was the final perilous definition of imperial power, determining where Russian control ended and where British influence in Afghanistan began. Britain, which treated Afghanistan as a protectorate, was deeply alarmed by the Russian advance in the 1880s. The final dispute arose over the small Panjshat region, claimed by both Russian and Afghan forces. Russian and Afghan troops were stationed within miles of each other, building small forts in a tense standoff. On March 30, 1885, the Russians, exhausted by the standoff, attacked the Afghans at Kushka, scattering the defenders and seizing the region. Britain viewed this as a direct affront to its imperial interests. For a few perilous days after the news reached London and St. Petersburg, there was widespread talk of an immediate declaration of war. The two greatest empires in the world stood primed to unleash a conflict far more devastating than any seen before, all over a remote, desolate dispute in Central Asia. Thankfully, cooler heads ultimately prevailed, a massive relief to the world. The Afghan Emir, Abdurrahman Khan, personally urged the two great powers to negotiate rather than ignite an imperial war that would ravage his own territory. The resulting diplomatic agreement saw Britain reluctantly agree to recognize Russian control up to the seized point of Kushka, while Russia, in turn, agreed to respect Afghanistan's borders beyond that line. From that moment, Kushka officially marked the southmost extent of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, representing the final geographical limit of this decades-long conquest. Russia's dramatic and costly expansion into Central Asia was a successful imperial process that secured its control until the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Today, while these lands stand firmly and confidently as their own sovereign nations, the legacy of that conquest, economic, political, and cultural, remains a powerful force, forever linking their history to that of Russia. This complex and compelling narrative, which involved centuries of planning, massive failures, strategic genius, and devastating violence, demonstrates just how far empires are willing to go and how much is lost in the relentless pursuit of territory and prestige.
If you were captivated by this complex history, Ensure you subscribe and like the video. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us which forgotten history you want us to explore next in this animated series. Stay tuned, the next chapter of history is uploading soon.